Welcome back to another explainer. Today, we are looking at what is absolutely one of the most turbulent, defining, and frankly, fascinating periods in modern Indian history. We're talking about the years between 1942 and 1945. This was the absolute climax of the struggle for independence, and it was all happening right in the shadow of the Second World War. But you know what makes this specific era so unique? The push for freedom wasn't just happening on one single front. It was actually happening across three completely distinct methodologies, with each one challenging British rule in a totally different way.
So here is our roadmap for today. We'll be covering three key fronts: the mass uprising of Quit India, the diplomatic efforts to break the deadlock, and the armed resistance of the INA.
Let's dive right into our first front, the mass uprising, widely known as Quit India, the spontaneous civilian explosion of 1942.
Now, you might be wondering, why did this explosion happen specifically in 1942? Well, it was essentially a perfect storm. The British had just sent the Cripps mission to offer some constitutional reforms, but it completely failed. It basically exposed a real lack of British will to concede actual independence. Add to that the severe wartime hardships. I mean, we're talking skyrocketing prices and severe shortages of basic goods like rice and salt. Plus, there was a very real, palpable fear among the public. The Japanese military was advancing rapidly through Southeast Asia, right toward India's borders. There were even intense fears that the British would implement a scorched earth policy in places like Assam and Bengal, literally destroying local resources just to keep them away from the Japanese. Because of all this, the Indian leadership felt they absolutely had to act to prepare the masses for a possible invasion and to demand immediate independence.
And what's really brilliant about this is the strategic genius behind it. At the historic meeting at Gowalia Tank in Bombay in August 1942, Gandhi didn't just call for random chaos. No, he issued highly targeted instructions. For instance, he didn't ask government servants to quit their jobs. He asked them to stay, but openly declare their allegiance to the Congress. He didn't tell soldiers to desert, but gave strict orders not to fire on their own people. Students were told to leave their studies only if they were confident they could stay out. And peasants? They were given nuanced instructions about paying rent depending on whether their local landlords were pro or anti-government. So you see, this wasn't just a blind riot. It was a highly organized blueprint for civil disobedience.
This definitely wasn't just another protest. Gandhi's legendary call, "Do or die," injected an unbelievable, unyielding sense of purpose into the masses. This was it, the final push. There was absolutely no going back from this demand for an immediate British withdrawal. Of course, the British tried to crush this instantly. On August 9th, just hours after the resolution passed, they arrested Gandhi and the entire Congress leadership. But here's the crazy part. Instead of killing the movement, this decapitation sparked a massive, leaderless uprising across the country. The general public went on a rampage, directly attacking symbols of British authority. We're talking cutting telegraph lines, uprooting railway tracks, the whole shebang. Astonishingly, in places like Gowalia in UP, Tamluk in Bengal, and Satara in Maharashtra, the people actually established parallel governments. And the demographics of the participants were shifting too. Youth and women were incredibly active at the forefront. Figures like Aruna Asaf Ali and Usha Mehta became absolute legends, with Mehta even helping to run an underground secret Congress radio to keep the resistance connected. 10,000. That is the staggering estimated number of civilians killed during this time, and it shows just how brutally the government suppressed this grassroots uprising. Even though martial law wasn't officially declared, the British response was ruthless. Agitating crowds were lathi-charged, tear-gassed, and fired upon. Entire rebellious villages were heavily fined or subjected to mass flogging. The sheer scale of that casualty number tells you that the colonial state essentially had to wage a war against the civilian population just to maintain control. As those mass protests were violently suppressed, the nation plunged into an unimaginable tragedy. While still locked up in prison, Gandhi undertook a 21-day fast in February 1943 to protest the government's incredibly harsh actions against the Indian people. But at the exact same time, all those wartime disruptions and resource diversions that the nationalists had warned about, well, they contributed to the horrific Bengal famine of 1943. Just think about how bleak this was for a second. Millions of people were starving in a devastating humanitarian crisis, playing out right in the background of this intense political struggle. Okay, let's move to our second front, breaking the deadlock, diplomacy. This was the war of words and political pacts. While the streets were chaotic, the political divide at the negotiating table was incredibly deep.
In 1944, the Rajagopalachari formula tried to find some common ground. The idea was this: the Muslim League would endorse the demand for independence and cooperate in a provisional government. In return, after the war, a plebiscite, a direct vote, would be held in Muslim-majority areas to decide on a separate sovereign state. But Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the League firmly objected. Jinnah demanded that only the Muslim population in those specific areas should vote in the plebiscite, not the entire population. He also firmly opposed the idea of any common central government, even for shared issues like defense or commerce. So the deadlock remained as firm as ever. Following that, we see another attempt to bridge the divide, which introduced a concept that would have massive future consequences: the idea of parity. The Desai-Liaqat Pact proposed an interim government where the Congress and the Muslim League would nominate an equal number of persons to the central legislature, while keeping 20% of the seats reserved for other minorities. Now, while this specific draft agreement didn't actually materialize into a final settlement, it was a real game changer, because the idea of numerical parity between the Congress and the League was now officially on the table. Fast forward a bit to 1945. The war is ending, so why did the British suddenly rush back to the negotiating table? Well, external pressure. General elections were looming in England in mid-1945, and Winston Churchill's Conservative government really needed to look like they were actively solving the India problem. Plus, their global allies, specifically the US, the USSR, and China, were putting intense pressure on Britain to secure full Indian cooperation for the remainder of the war effort against Japan. This pressure leaves Lord Wavell to release the leaders from jail in June 1945 and present a brand new plan to finally transfer substantial executive power. The Wavell plan was a major shift. The Executive Council would become almost entirely Indian. The only British members left would be the Viceroy and the Commander-in-Chief. And crucially, the plan proposed equal representation on this council for caste Hindus and Muslims. But just like before, the plan crashed right into a wall of competing claims. The Muslim League's stance was that since it represented the Muslims of India, it should have the exclusive right to nominate all the Muslim members to this new council. The Congress, on the other hand, vehemently objected to that. Congress asserted it was a secular, national body that represented all Indians, and it absolutely refused to be categorized or reduced to merely a caste Hindu party. Because they couldn't agree on this, Lord Wavell simply declared the conference a failure. And this was a monumental mistake on his part, as it practically handed a veto power to the Muslim League for any future constitutional progress. All right, let's pivot outside of India's borders to our third and final front, the armed resistance, the INA. Subhas Bose and the radical alternative. The Indian National Army, or INA, didn't just materialize overnight. It actually began in September 1942, when an Indian Army officer named Mohan Singh, who had been taken prisoner by the Japanese, formed the 1st Division utilizing Indian prisoners of war. But the movement really caught fire in October 1943 when Subhas Chandra Bose arrived in Singapore. He formed the Provisional Government for Free India. By March 1944, this wasn't just an idea anymore. INA battalions actually crossed the Indian border, fighting alongside Japanese forces in an armed bid to drive the British out. Give me blood, I will give you freedom. Subhas Chandra Bose was a brilliant and radical leader. He'd previously clashed with Gandhi over the use of militant methods, fundamentally believing that an empire built on force could only be dislodged by force. This single legendary quote captured the imagination of thousands of expatriate Indians across Southeast Asia. They threw everything they had into the cause, funding and physically joining the INA. And the INA was absolutely not just some ragtag militia. Look at the sheer scale of Bose's vision here. The provisional government was officially recognized by the Axis powers. They formally declared war on Britain and the United States. And, incredibly progressively for the 1940s, Bose formed the Rani Jhansi Regiment. This was an exclusive women's combat unit led by figures like Lakshmi Swaminathan, proving that the armed struggle was meant to include every single segment of Indian society. Unfortunately for the INA, global military shifts ultimately crushed their campaign. The steady retreat of the Japanese military destroyed the INA's hopes of a successful mainland invasion. When Japan formally surrendered to the Allies in August 1945, the INA had no choice but to surrender as well. Tragically, just days later, Subhas Chandra Bose reportedly died in a mysterious plane crash in Taiwan, abruptly ending the leadership of this armed resistance. Now, with the soldiers captured, the British thought they could make an example of the INA prisoners by holding public court-martials at the Red Fort in Delhi. They put 3 officers on trial together: Prem Kumar Sahgal, a Hindu, Shahnawaz Khan, a Muslim, and Gurbakh Singh Dhillon, a Sikh. But instead of projecting British strength, this move completely backfired. It sparked an unprecedented, massive wave of sympathy. Suddenly, the entire nation, cutting across every political and religious line, united to demand the release of these soldiers, whom they viewed as great patriots. It became an absolute volcano of nationalist sentiment.
So, what does this all mean? Think about it. Over just a few years, the British had to face a relentless civilian uprising that proved they had completely lost the consent of the governed. They faced deadlocked diplomatic negotiations that proved the constitutional status quo was entirely broken. And they faced an armed rebellion from their own former soldiers. It wasn't just one thing. It was the crushing combined pressure of all three of these fronts that made it undeniably clear. The illusion of perpetual British rule was shattered, and their time in India was finally over.